Greetings. Today I'm going to discuss a hero of the Bible who is from the Faith Hall of Fame, as I call it, Hebrews 11, and discuss a bit about faith and how it worked in that person's life. And there's a story that President Reagan used to enjoy telling, I think, about faith. And I'll say that, I'll start it by saying that there was a man who was thrown from his vehicle, and he's on the ledge of a cliff now and holding on for dear life because it's a long drop. So, as he's dangling there, he prays to God, "Oh God, please, it's going to take a miracle to get me out of this. Help me out of this." And so God intervenes. A voice, he hears a voice that tells him, "Yes, if you have the faith, then just take your hands off the ledge there, and I'm going to get you out of here." And so the man looks down, and then he looks up and says, "Is anybody else up there?" So he needed more faith. And faith is defined in Hebrews 11. I want to go there. That, as I said, I call that chapter the Faith Hall of Fame, and it defines faith. And the situation is, or the concept is, that if something is right in front of you, you see it, you know it. But if you don't have all the evidence, not blind faith, you have some evidence, but not 100%, and yet to make up for what you lack, you have faith. And that's what it says in Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. Our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors, through history, had faith, and it is, of course, to their credit. And some are mentioned here in the 32nd verse of Hebrews 11. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets. So one of the people mentioned here is Gideon. And it's interesting how God built up his faith, kept doing miracles for him, very patiently working with him and giving him the courage to do the impossible. God deliberately worked out circumstances so that Israel would be miraculously delivered at the time of Gideon, as a witness to his church at that time. And of course, it's important for us to be aware of what God has done through history. As Moses told the children of Israel in Deuteronomy 32 verse 7, he said, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father and he will show you, your elders and they will tell you." So here's one elder that's going to tell you something about the history of how God worked with his people. I want to go to Mark, the 9th chapter, and here you see an example of somebody who had faith, and yet, he needed his faith to be fortified, to be encouraged. This is Matthew 9, where a man's son, he had a son who was a young man, and this young man from childhood had a problem with demon possession. And the disciples of Christ could not cast out the demon. Of course, Jesus Christ could. But in Mark 9:24, immediately the father of the child cried out and said, well, let me go first to verse 23, what Jesus says to the father of this young man. Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." So he had faith, but he needed more faith, and you could understand the circumstances. The disciples were not able to cast out the demon. Obviously, Jesus could and did. So he says, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And that's, I would think, true of all of us. "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And Jesus tells us in Luke 17 how we can increase our faith. I want to go to the 5th verse of Luke 17. And the apostle said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." And if you read the passage here, what he's saying is, first of all, he talks about the power of faith, and then he says, if you if you are serving God, and of course we serve God by really serving our fellow human beings, by in effect, leaving this world a better place for the fact that we've been in it. Put it that way. What the Jews call, what my community calls tikkun olam, repairing the world. If we are true servants of God, true servants of our fellow human beings, if we go above and beyond in doing good, if we go above and beyond in doing good, then that will actually increase our faith. So that's something to consider. And you see it there. I believe that's a way to understand that passage in Luke 17. Now, last week I talked about the plan of God, and particularly how Paul talks about how God is going to work with Paul's people, the people of Israel. And I wanted to quote from a text, because last week I said it from memory, but I want to just quote from a text here. Back in 1957, I was given this text, Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. This is an illustrated version of it, a section of the Talmud, and it's introduced. I believe this comes from the tractate Sanhedrin, and it's this statement. I'm going to quote it right out of the text. Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelik la'olam haba. So all Israel will have a share in the world to come. And Paul, who studied at the feet of Gamaliel, tells us this in the first part of Romans 11, verse 26. Romans 11, verse 26. Let's go there. And it says, and Paul writes, and so all Israel will be saved. So it's very similar to that passage there in the Talmud. Anyway, if you want to know more about that subject, then I'll refer you to last week's message. This week's message, I'm focusing on a hero from the Faith Hall of Fame, Gideon, and how God worked with Gideon from the tribe of Manasseh. And I think he was actually from the eastern branch of that tribe. And Gideon was a person who believed, but at the same time, he was somewhat like that father in the book of Mark. He needed his belief, let's say, buttressed, encouraged. And it's interesting how God worked patiently with him and performed a tremendous miracle through him. So let's first get the background. Israel sinned very badly, and so God allowed them to be oppressed by the Midianites, and they cried out because of the oppression. It was very intense, very severe. I want to go to Judges 6. We're going back now to the beginning of the 12th century, early in the 12th century BC. Early in the 12th century BC. And in the 6th chapter, they're crying out to God, and because of the oppression. And in verse, I'm in chapter 6, and I'm in verse 8. And the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel, who said to them, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of bondage." So remember what God did for us. Remember what God did for you in your life, what He does for you. We depend upon God for every beat of our heart, every breath of air we breathe. "And I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice." So now we have a bit of an interruption going here, but I'm going to continue talking. So anyway, in verse 11, we have Gideon now. And as the situation is so serious that he has to hide the work that he's doing. Instead of threshing wheat out in the open as would be normal, he does it where he would press wine, and where he normally would press wine, and because he doesn't want the Midianites to know what he's doing. The situation is not serious. But who appears to him? Actually, that's the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. It's the Logos. God is one in three ways: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And God at times appeared to his people as his own communicator, as the communicator of his will. He appeared to them as the uncreated angel, the messenger of the Lord, who really is the Lord himself, as the spokesman for his will. As I said, the Logos, the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, God the Son who became the Son of God. This is why in most of your translations the angel here is capitalized. So this is actually, I believe this is Jesus, pre-incarnate Jesus Christ appearing to Gideon. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." And Gideon was probably thinking that calling Gideon a mighty man of valor would be the same as calling me a mechanic. Wow, a mighty man of valor? You see what he's doing? He's hiding what he's doing so the Midianites won't know about it. But he became a mighty man of valor, and he became a judge over Israel. Gideon said to him, "Oh my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles, which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." Well, but they brought it on themselves. Anyway, then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" So if God gives you a mission, he'll give you the means to fulfill it. You may remember how reluctant Moses was when God, at first he thought the Israelites would follow him, but it didn't turn out that way, so he fled. According to the how I think Stephen and even Josephus, at first he thought he was going to deliver them, but no, he had to run away. Then 40 years later, he's thinking, "Who am I that I should do it?" And Gideon has the same attitude, but God is telling him, "Have I not sent you?" So Gideon evidently means a hewer, perhaps who chops down trees. And of course trees are important as building materials and as fuel, and also some areas have to be cleared for human settlement and so on. Anyway, and of course he cut down, as you'll see later, the image of Baal, and he cut down the Midianites as well, the oppressors of Israel. So he said to him, "Oh my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." So you see, he's me, a hero. And the Lord said to him, "Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." You're going to get rid of all of them. And they brought against him, I'm trying to remember, I think it's like 135,000, I think it was, that they brought against him, something like that. Or I'll get to that figure later, I guess. And he had 300, and he was the winner, as you know. And then he said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me." You'd think that he would have that sense that God could have made himself appear in such a way, that Gideon would know. So he says, "Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring you my offering and set it before you." And he said, "I will wait until you come back." So God is patiently working with this man and building up his faith. And see, he is a hero. When people read about him, they read more about the heroics than this part. So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread and an ephah of flour, about a bushel of flour, and unleavened bread, I guess because he was in a hurry. But also, interestingly, this very likely was the spring of the year. That's when battles take place in the Middle East. The meal he put in a basket, the meat he put in a basket And he put the broth in a pot, and he brought them to him under the terebinth tree and presented them. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth." And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, and the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. So this is a miracle, and then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. He had seen God. This was, as I said, the uncreated angel. God is his own messenger. God is the communicator of his will, who appeared in that form to Hagar. And he appeared in that form as a man wrestling with Jacob. And you remember how Jacob said, I've confronted God, and I'm still alive. You remember, go back to Genesis 32. Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, "Alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." Then the Lord said to him, "Peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die." So maybe he just heard the voice and didn't necessarily see anybody then. So Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, "The Eternal is Peace," right? Adonai Shalom. To this day, of course, it would be back then Yahweh, but modern day Jews pronounce it Adonai, Hashem, when they're speaking in conversation. The Lord is peace. To this day, it is still in Orphra of the Abiezrites. So it's still actually, as this was written, we have evidence of this event because the altar was still there when this account was written. Now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, "Take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it." So even his father had gotten involved in this idolatry, but maybe he did it. He seemed to have been a VIP in the area there, and maybe he did it just because it was the thing to do to sort of keep everybody together, because there was a lot of paganism going on. But anyway, and there it is. And he told him to tear it down. Now that's a very courageous act, but it would build up his faith if he could do it and get away with it, right? And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the rock in the proper arrangement. Excuse me. And take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image which you shall cut down. So there was an Asherah there. There was a wooden image, a pole or a tree that had been put there to honor a goddess. There was an altar of Baal, so we had the Baal and the god and goddess of the pagans, of the major ones. And so Gideon took 10 men from. Now it's interesting. He didn't just go himself. He took 10 men. So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants. So you see, he was a well-to-do person. And from among his servants, evidently his father was a VIP in that community. So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants and did as the Lord had said to him. And because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. So here again, he does it, but not in the most courageous way. He does it at night. But now the next day, daylight comes, and when the men of the city arose early in the morning, there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image that was beside it was cut down, and the second bull was being offered on the altar which had been built. So evidently they saw the burning of the bull, and so they were aware that a sacrifice was being offered, but not to Baal, right, to the God of Israel. So they said to one another, "Who has done this thing?" And when they had inquired and asked, they said, "Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing." And the men of the city said to Joash, "Bring out your son, that he may die, because he has torn down the altar of Baal, and because he has cut down the wooden image that was beside it." Now give his father credit for a very wise answer. But Joash said to all who stood against him, "Would you plead for Baal? If he's so powerful, let him punish them." If you think it's so important to have a statue of Baal, let's see what happens. See what kind of result happens. But Joash said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. Why should anybody have to plead for Baal? Let him plead for himself. He's supposed to be a god. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down. So therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, right? Yerubbaal, the one who let Baal plead. Let Baal plead, because he's the one that defied Baal, who was of course a false god. Let Baal plead, saying, let Baal plead against him, because he has torn down his altar. Therefore, they let it alone, and I think this also built up Gideon, and perhaps encouraged them to, to go back to the God of Israel. They had heard from that prophet that that's what they should do. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites, the people of the east, gathered together, and they crossed over and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. So it's looking pretty bad. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. So here we see, God the Holy Spirit. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also gathered behind him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. So many of the northern tribes, many people from the northern tribes came together to Gideon. And even then, even though Gideon had seen these signs, even though people now were rallying behind him, and even though he had destroyed the pagan altars and had lived to tell about it, and had gathered people around him, in spite of all that, he still wanted more signs from God. And God was patient with him and indulged him, you could say. So Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. He wanted yet another miracle. And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece together, he wrung the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. But he still wants another miracle. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. So evidently God wanted to take this person and make a hero out of him. And he did what was necessary to do that. So as I said, if God gives you a job to do, he'll see to it that you get it done. So now we see that he gathers together Israelites, and thousands of them, and yet God reduces the number in two different ways, down to, I think if you read it according to the way I understand it, to the most courageous of them, just 300 of them. And you can read about how these 300 were able to attack at night, panic the other side, and cause the other side to flee. And I'm wanting to take a look at the number here of the Midianites that were left by the time they got done with them. Yes, I want to go to Judges 8 and verse 10, I believe it is. It talks about 15,000 left because 120,000 who drew the sword had fallen. So now we have just, in other words, we have 135,000, only 15,000 are left, and he defeats them if you go to Judges 8. So it's just amazing. Of course, he kept gathering more people around him. By the time he won the first battle, then he had the Ephraimites who joined him, and he had more forces for the second battle. So anyway, I wanted to mention a couple of things though about this miraculous triumph. He told the people they had torches and pitchers and shofarot, ram's horns, and you can read about what they did. But in verse 20, he tells them, I guess in verse 18, he tells them this: when I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp, and say, of the Lord and of Gideon. The word sword, the sword is not there, just of the Lord and of Gideon. So this was the essence of their statement. But what we're doing is the Lord's doing and Gideon's doing. We're following the leader that the Lord has appointed, and the Lord is behind us. This is of the Lord and of Gideon. Now later on we see the whole statement, and we see that they're talking about, of course, the power that they're exercising, which they're exercising on God's behalf and on Gideon's behalf. And so finally, when they actually do break their pitchers, have their torches, and blow their horns, they cry at the end of verse 20, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Now, believe it or not, before this miracle, and in spite of all the other miracles that God did, he still had to strengthen Gideon again by an earlier miracle before the battle took place. And he has him go down to listen, overhear what some of the enemies of Israel are saying. And he even tells him to take a servant with him. Let me look at the statement here. In verse 9 of Judges 7. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down, then go down to the camp with Purah your servant. So even here, he says, all right, if you have to take somebody else, take somebody else. And anyway, it says servant here, but I think the literally it says young man. So this was maybe somebody younger than Gideon who was assisting him. And you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people in the east, were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts. You see, there was quite a number, as I said earlier. And their camels were without number as the sand of the seashore in multitude. So that's the way it would appear to you if you were there. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. I'm in verse 13, and he said, I've had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. Then his companion, and barley is what is the most basic kind of food. In other words, it's not impressive, as it were. So in effect, this humble force overcomes the camp of Midian. Then the companion answered and said, this is nothing else, but it could have been the time of the barley harvest when this was taking place. As I said, the spring. Then his companions answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon. Again, the sword of Gideon is mentioned. The son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. So the Midianites, even though there were so many of them, were somewhat tense. And when everything erupted, they thought a much larger force was coming against them. Who would dream that 300 men would do that? They must have thought, wow, this large force is coming against us. And it was night, so they began battling one another. And you can read about how God confused them, and and they were fighting one another and so on. I'm not reading much of the whole account. I'm covering highlights here, or at least from my point of view. In other words, the point I'm trying to bring out today. And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation that he worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. So finally, after he now is fully convinced. His faith is strong. And he went out with a plan, and the plan worked. And then he gathered more around him, and and then it had a complete triumph over the Midianites and the others. And so as a result, we had peace for 40 years. And they wanted to actually make Gideon into a king. Let me put it this way: they wanted to establish a dynasty where Gideon would be king, then his son, but God was ruling through judges at this time, not through a dynasty, not through a monarchy. And so Gideon, so in verse 22, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." They wanted to establish a monarchy with the family of Gideon. But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." And this is what Samuel wanted too. But at that time the people insisted on a king, and God allowed them to have a king, but he chose the king. And so that background, or you can go into that in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter. Anyway, I want to mention what it says in verse 28 about Gideon. Then Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. So Gideon evidently had played the part of judge, it would seem, and not as king, but as judge. And Israel had, in that part of the country, where Gideon was, that area around Manasseh there, northern part of Israel, there was peace for 40 years. So this great miracle, and God refers to that later on in the Bible. I believe you find in Psalm 83 where that victory is discussed, and I'm just going to go there to just confirm, without going into the Psalm, but just to confirm. I believe you find in Psalm 83 that at another time in the history of Israel, when they're surrounded by enemies, those triumphs are brought up, and right, and an earlier one as well, under Deborah and Barak is brought up. But if you look at Psalm 83, the Judges 5 is brought up, and then Judges 7 and 8 are brought up in Psalm 83. And this could be referring to a later event in the history of Judah, but it could also be prophetic. And many people think of it also as yet to be fulfilled, or maybe to be fulfilled on another level, maybe later on. Time will tell. So we have here a hero of faith, and yet God worked patiently with him, performing miracle after miracle to strengthen his faith. And then a tremendous victory occurs with a small number defeating a much greater number, and then as a result gathering strength and completely subduing the enemy. And it's just a very inspiring account to read. But you see, there's a lot more to it than maybe you heard as a child in Sunday school. There's really a lot to the account. When you read the account, there's much more to glean out of it. But it's interesting that in a couple of places we find the mention of the sword of Gideon. God gave Gideon might and power, and so we have in effect the sword of Gideon. Now, when you go to Revelation 19, here you find that Jesus Christ, who appeared to Gideon and gave him that strength and power and intervened for him, that Jesus Christ is coming as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Revelation 19. And you see now the sword of Jesus Christ. We saw the sword of Gideon in Judges. Now in Revelation 19, now in verse 15, now out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations, and he himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So this So the King of Kings, who's both Davidic and divine, who I believe appeared in this pre-incarnate form to Gideon and gave Gideon his sword, now he wields the divine sword and comes to rule over the nations and to bring them, in spite of themselves at first, but finally as they settle down and obey, he brings them peace, prosperity, true freedom, all their hopes and dreams fulfilled by living according to God's way. And so the victory of Gideon, now we see, eventually becomes the victory of Jesus Christ and the saints. So this is something to consider as we discuss a member of the Faith Hall of Fame. All the best to you and yours.